Very good. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the developmental state, which means primarily semi-democratic and non-democratic governments who have been successful in bringing about economic development and increasing the standard of living of their citizens. And then we're going to look at a different type of non-democratic government, the predatory state, where a government uses its monopoly of political power to extract resources from society rather than to serve the society. Okay, so we talked about some of the required conditions for a successful developmental state. Here are a few items in terms of what does it take for what kind of political institutions must be in place in order to have a successful developmental state and achieve those goals that we mentioned. Remember, we said that the developmental state, the ruling elite, believe that their legitimacy is not in support of the people through the electoral vote in a democracy. They believe that they gain legitimacy by bringing about economic success. So economic progress is considered a source of legitimacy. There are some spots over there. So in order to be successful in transforming the economy, you need a well-functioning bureaucracy. Therefore, you want to make sure at all levels of bureaucracy, the director, the mid-level managers, the civil servants, have an incentive to carry out their duties and support investment, support the private sector, to make sure that goods and services that must be provided by government are actually provided efficiently and successfully. So for that you need to have good wage and benefit mechanism, good monitoring and evaluation of public sector employees. That itself is very important. Now, there is a tendency and there is opportunity for anyone who has a public sector responsibility to try to benefit themselves. Because if you are in a position to issue a license, you can always demand some kind of bribe to issue a license. If you are a government official that must enforce the law, when you identify a person who has broken the law, you have an opportunity to demand bribe in order to look the other way. And the person who has committed the crime would have an incentive to pay you a bribe so that they won't be prosecuted. All of that creates many opportunities for corruption. Therefore, in order to be successful as a developmental state, you need mechanisms to prevent corruption. In a well-functioning democracy, freedom of the press serves a very important purpose. The reporters, the investigators, the journalists have an incentive to identify corrupt officials and expose them. In a non-democratic system, you do not have that freedom of the press or something like the Freedom of Information Act. Therefore, the government needs to have some other mechanisms, perhaps a very strong monitoring agency in order to prevent corruption. Because corruption can easily prevent a government from having economic progress. Political authority can be used to suppress demand for redistribution and allocate more resources to investment and capital formation. One of the main challenges for democracies is that various groups in society use their political power to try to negotiate a better position for themselves. In the United States, for example, the workers have the right to go on strike, correct? It's a democratic right. In non-democracy, if you are in a situation where majority of people would go on a strike, they would disrupt production to demand better wages, and you believe that for a few years you have to suppress the wages so that corporations can collect large profits and direct them towards investment, then you can bypass the democratic rights and suppress worker dissent, suppress labor protest. It is undemocratic, it is unfair, but in a developmental state, the government says, I am suppressing this group, not to extract resources for myself, but to invest that for the future. If they were free to go on a strike, or if they wanted to vote, they would vote for redistribution. And that happens all the time in democracies. But if you want to have long-term plan, you can use your non-democratic power to suppress for the benefit of long-term investment. Do you understand what I'm saying? It is not an ethical thing, it is not politically correct, but it is something that has been practiced. Many countries have long-term growth rates of 6 to 10%, but although workers and everyone feels the benefit of that eventually, but they don't allow the workers to negotiate. They set the wages and they arrest people who engage in political activism to try to mobilize the workers. Again, sometimes when you know that your investors might be engaging in simply display of wealth or using their wealth for personal benefit, in many countries, large investors try to take their investments out of the country for fear that there might be political instability. Then, number 4 says that in some cases, political coercion can be used to force some investors to invest in certain target industries. Meaning that the government says, this is our target industry, I want you to invest. If you don't, I'm going to do bad things to you. And of course, a complex supply chain requires coordination between multiple industries. Imagine you need to have mining, and then you have the steel industry. The product of the steel industry goes into, let's say, manufacturing for some automobiles. So you have multiple industries, various sectors of the economy, and you need to coordinate among them. Again, there might be disputes over prices, which, if you leave it to market forces, the cost of production for your competitive industry might be too high, and they cannot compete in international markets. What did we say last time? We said that one of the goals of these developmental states is to select specific industries for global market, for export markets. So they use their authority to create coordination. Maybe they use the authority to suppress the price of an intermediate good so that the cost of the final producer who is exporting to global market would be manageable, and they would remain profitable. So these are examples. To show you what they are, I believe, did we mention this? Okay, so all of these things happened in Korea. especially the fact that he practically arrested, as we said before, arrested a number of successful business persons and said and threatened them that I have all kinds of documents that I can use against you and send you to jail, but I'm going to look the other way if you are willing to invest in specific industries. In other words, used coercion. This is not democratic. Again, Korea, during his rule, suppressed labor demands. It suppressed all kinds of democratic demands. It was only after his rule was over that Korea transitioned into a democratic state. Okay. So the developmental state, obviously, like any other economic model or political model, has its own criticism. One of the criticisms is that some of these countries in which the government was bringing about long-term economic success, they did not engage in what we call macroeconomic discipline. They had long-term growth was successful, but the government had borrowed too much, and they ended up in what is known as a debt crisis. Debt crisis means that the national debt is so large that the government cannot pay the interest on national debt, especially when it is foreign debt. And then the currency of the country might collapse, might lose its value because of the pressure of very high value of debt. That's when they have to change course. They often go to the International Monetary Fund and request emergency loans. And we see that some of these developmental states have experienced this kind of deficit, inflation, and macroeconomic instability, despite the fact that they were showing good performance in economic development. Okay, so you can see here some examples of instability for some countries. The graph that you have shows the solid line, which represents the performance of GDP growth for East Asia and Pacific countries. And then you have the dashed line, which represents the Latin American countries. So experts blame the close relationship between politics and business groups for the 1979 crisis in Asia and question the usefulness of developmental state strategy. Because through government ties, big connections to these corporations, the government had arranged very large amounts of loans for them. And then they suddenly faced a very serious crisis. So you can see there were periods where they experienced negative economic growth on average. One of the major crises in Asia, as you can see, was 1998, where there was a severe decline in GDP, annual growth of GDP. You can see 1998 was -6%. And this was a result of a sudden financial crisis. The banks in Asia, in many countries such as Malaysia, Korea, faced a severe crisis, and the currency was about to collapse. When they say banking crisis, it means that foreign investors were suddenly trying to pull their money out of banks of one country. It is called a currency run, when there is a rush by international investors to withdraw their income from their savings from a specific country. So occasionally even developmental states face severe crisis. It's not that they are always immune to financial crisis. Of course, a major crisis happened in Latin America, that was 1982-83, and this was because of severe debt of countries like Argentina. Even though under military rule prior to that, for decades they had stability, but that stability was associated with borrowing a significant amount of money. Okay, so one of the changes that took place after these crises in many of these developmental states was that they tried to reform their economies, to liberalize, to reduce the role of government and encourage and focus more on market forces. This kind of reform is referred to as the Washington Consensus, because the United States has always advocated for free markets and minimum government intervention, saying that all that government should do is to provide public goods and create a fair regulatory environment and allow the forces of market to determine how much and where to invest. So after this crisis, there was a move towards Washington Consensus, but when we look at the economic growth of these countries, we observe that after these reforms, their average rate of growth slowed down. Of course, not every country has adopted these policies. For example, China did not adopt them. Any questions? Comments? Very good. Okay, so still we have some countries that are committed to being developmental states. But more and more countries are sort of moving towards using the market as much as possible, using the forces of market, supply and demand. So now when we look at government interventions, they are more similar to what you have learned in your introductory economic classes. As you can see, one of the major roles that has continued is that the government should intervene when there is a market failure, and you are familiar with these. These are the standard market failures that require government intervention. So this new approach ignores the significance of growth that was made by developmental state and rather focuses on priority of market and trying to strengthen the private sector. It doesn't necessarily lead to as fast rates of growth as a country can experience when a developmental state intervenes and tries to direct investments. But developmental states run into economic crisis sometimes, and we mentioned that. And sometimes, when we look at their history, they have run into political crisis and have had to abandon the authoritarian state and transition into democracy because of the changing position of the citizens. For example, maybe 40 years ago, majority of people had high school degree level of education, and they were less aware of their political rights. But once they are highly educated and you have a majority of people with university degrees, they demand certain political rights and they would like to participate. So sometimes the progress of developmental state itself creates a new condition where the state has to transform itself, because the people will no longer simply accept to live under dictatorship. Doesn't happen all the time, but it happens occasionally. So now let's go to our discussion of the predatory state. Okay, so I have been looking around to see if I can find a more recent article for you, but still, this seems to be a very good article that explains the concept of predatory state, and it also has some good case studies. Here, this is by Peter Evans, and you can see the picture. So state intervention, as we have seen, plays an important role in development. But this intervention can be good, bad, or even ugly. What matters is that the state has monopoly of political power and also coercive power. It's the only institution that is allowed to have arms and intervene and enforce the law. So that significant amount of power can be abused just as easily as it can be used to guide the society into a desirable state. So when we look at the role of the state, we see that there are three important roles to pay attention to. And we are already familiar with this. The state performs crucial functions that are essential for economic transformation. We have seen that. Public goods is a good example of that. Coordination is a good example. The need for coordination. Incumbent states, meaning the current existing ruling groups in a society, can extract and redistribute rent to their members and supporters. So this is an important concern, that because the state has power, it can redistribute rent to its supporters. Now, in democracies, government engages in redistribution, but it is directed according to the pressure of interest groups, correct? We saw the role of interest groups in democratic behavior. But those interest groups could be external to the government, and they can simply lobby the government for their group. That could be an industrial group, a labor movement, an NGO. But in a predatory state, it is the supporters and members of the small elite that use the power, the political power of the state to collect rent in their own favor. Not like rent of a rental house, but any kind of profit or gain that is made possible through political power. That's what we call rent. Such as when government grants a monopoly to a company, and that company can generate significant amount of profit, we call that rent. So these two characteristics vary from state to state. Good performance versus abuse of power for the gain of the ruling elite. It's this variation that determines whether a state is developmental state or predatory state. And countries can change their position depending on the behavior of the government. A government that was predatory can become developmental state. And a government that, or a ruling elite that was developmental state, can regress into becoming a predatory state. There is no guarantee that once a government achieves a certain state, certain characteristic, it will necessarily always stay in that position. We see that even in democracies. Even in a country like the United States, there are always risks of deviation from what is an ideal, well-functioning democracy. So to give you an example, look at these two dimensions. These are the same two dimensions that we talked about in previous slide. So state activities that support the government. Imagine we define a scale where the further you are on the horizontal axis means the government is engaged in more and more activities that are beneficial for economic progress, social progress of the society. So this represents level of good behavior. On the other hand, this vertical axis represents the level of extraction, predatory behavior. So let's look at this just a pure imaginary example. A country could be in position A, where it is a minimal intervention government in 1960. Then in 1970s, it can become a predatory state. Then gradually, there is political reform. It moves further to become a state that's a little predatory, a little developmental, and finally, gradually, it becomes a state that is fully committed to serving the society and behaving to benefit the society. We have had this experience in some countries. In Latin America, you can find countries that moved into dictatorship, authoritarian rule by military generals, after being a democracy. Then they were gradually opened up and moved into a situation where it was progressing towards becoming a good government. And finally, after some point, it became, for example, a fully functioning democracy. Okay? So this can happen all the time. So we can assign names to this. A country like D is harmless, useless in terms of its role. It doesn't do anything and it doesn't do any harm either. Then C could be an ugly government that extracts. B is a bad government that's predatory, developmental state. And finally, A is an ideal state, which extracts very little and serves the society. This is the ideal state that every country wants to achieve. But obviously, it's not easy to get there. Another thing to keep in mind is that when we look at the history of Western countries, the role of government and the intervention of government has gone through significant changes. And we said this before. Even modern democracies have had a period of time where they have had the role of a developmental state. And even more important than that, when we look at the history of successful capitalist countries, we see that part of that success is a result of a strong, competent, and effective government, especially an effective bureaucracy. So this is studied by Karl Poliani. I believe this was maybe a Polish economist, I'm not sure, but I have the explanation under it. You can always find out, or you can Google it. But he made this observation that a strong, effective state is a key factor in success of countries like England, which was considered the bastion and the center of capitalism before that role was transferred to the United States. And the argument is that the road to the free market was opened and kept open by an enormous increase in continuous, centrally organized and controlled interventions. So government has an important role to play even in a free market capitalist economy. That role is to maintain good regulations, maintain good political institutions, so that disputes are resolved, and so that the greed and interest of large corporations for profit, the profit maximization incentive, is directed towards productive activity, so that it's more profitable to invest and produce than to simply extract rent from a monopoly position that is supported by political power. And then perhaps you have heard the name of Max Weber. Max Weber is considered the father of the science of sociology. And he is famous for his study of capitalism, what contributed to the success of capitalism in Europe, and also his study of bureaucracy, the role of bureaucracy in success of European economies and then the United States. So he says capitalism and bureaucracy are interconnected, have found each other and belong intimately together. The operation of a large-scale capitalist enterprise, large corporations, depends on the availability of the kind of order that only a modern bureaucratic state could provide. And he uses the phrase bureaucratic state. And of course, the best example of an active bureaucracy that played a very important role in progress is France. France is always known for bureaucracy, but efficient bureaucracy in that country. England has also had bureaucracy, US has bureaucracy, but not as large, as sophisticated as France. And for a long time in France, the most successful graduates of top universities, they were interested in working for the government, in top government jobs, because it enjoyed such a high status in society. Being a bureaucrat was just as important in terms of social status as somebody being head of a big corporation in the United States. So one form of government intervention that we observe in successful Western democracies and Western capitalist systems is efficient and effective bureaucracy. It is invisible, but if you have successful corporations like Apple, Amazon, all of these kind of corporations, their success is made possible by a well-functioning political bureaucratic system. We don't see that, but it's there, and it's continuously providing this environment in which these corporations can function and be successful. For example, judiciary that is efficient, and people and corporations trust the judiciary, and it is successful in resolving disputes between corporations, because corporations continuously, all the time, file complaints against each other saying that you have violated my patent, you are engaging in price manipulation, or all kinds of things that they think is illegal. So you need an efficient system that quickly addresses that without forcing them into bankruptcy, resolving disputes so that as many corporations as possible are successful. But on the other hand, you could have states where the government does the exact opposite, engages in predation. And unfortunately, sometimes predatory governments are supported by democracies such as the United States in the name of Cold War or strategic objectives. Case study of predatory government, and we said that usually we identify a predatory state over a definite period of time because governments can change. So the argument is that the country of Zaire, which also is known as DRC or Democratic Republic of Congo, it's one of the largest countries in Africa, very rich in minerals, and because of that, it has been a target of colonialism by Europeans. And after the colonial period ended, it has always suffered from periods of dictatorship versus instability. And in some periods, all of the neighbors actually occupied large portions of Congo because it had suffered from civil war. And for example, at some period, I believe it was in early 2000, Uganda, Zambia, Angola, all the neighboring countries had troops in DRC. But the period that we are interested in is a period where it was under the rule of Joseph Mobutu Sese Seko, this leader here. It was the period from 1965 to 1997. It was after that it went into a period of civil war. So here are some of the minerals, and it's really very rich in all of this. You can see gold, diamonds, copper, cobalt, cotton, everything. It was a Belgian colony from 1879 to 1960. There was a period of anti-colonial rebellion between 1960 and 1965 until in 1965, Mobutu, this leader, finally gained control of the political system and created a single-party regime. And it lasted till 1996. And from then on, it went through a period of civil war, and that's when it was occupied by several neighbors, but it has achieved some level of democracy and stability afterwards. During this period, a leader that fought against him and tried to bring about a more democratic state was Patrice Lumumba, who is considered an anti-colonial hero throughout Africa, and he is revered similar to Che Guevara in Latin America. Maybe some of you have heard of Che Guevara. So he is considered a leader of anti-colonial fight, but recognized throughout Africa and even globally rather than just in his own state. So to look at the conditions of Congo, even today it's still a country which is highly underdeveloped. One of the consequences of predatory states is that the standard of living and quality of life declines for a majority of people, and inequality becomes very extreme. So if you look at these statistics, which are still recent, you can see life expectancy around 60, 64, where in most countries now life expectancy is above 80 years. Or infant mortality, 27.4. In modern countries now below 5. even in developing countries below poverty. So overall, the condition points to very poor healthcare. When we look at GDP per capita in terms of growth experience, you can see the experience of what happened. The takeover by Mobutu was in 1965, and look at the GDP per capita. The country dove into poverty, significant loss of income on average, all the way till 1996 when this rule came to an end. Okay, so under the period of predatory regime, we can see a sharp decline in per capita income, beginning in 1970s. So what causes this sharp decline? It is the abuse of power by the government, by the ruler and the people around him. And in Africa, many countries, including Zaire, are tribal countries, and in these tribal countries, often the leadership comes from a specific tribe, and it uses its power to assign all of the key positions to the members of his own tribe, and we have significant redistribution in favor of one tribe at the expense of others. But that causes instability and revolt very often, because then other tribes can mobilize against them. So as an image of poverty, you can see this image of children in a poor community. Poverty in this grew significantly worse as Seko and his inner circle grew wealthier in that period of time. So what were some of the governance institutions and conditions of DRC that resulted in this significant setback? Thank you. As you can see here, because of absolute power, governance was arbitrary. There was no clear rule of law. It was the leader that decided the law. The leader was the source of law and judgment. Bureaucracy was not professional. People were appointed to bureaucratic positions based on their loyalty to the leader and the ruling elite. And they knew that when they are in a bureaucratic position, that's simply an opportunity to extract resources from the society, to extract bribe and extortion. And what they collected, some of it was passed up to their supervisors and gradually going to the leader. And of course, those in key positions often were relatives or close friends of the leader. So to give you an example, a state controlled by a small group of individuals, the supporters of Mobutu Sese Seko, approximately 50 most trusted kingsmen, members of the tribe of Mobutu, were in charge of most key positions in government. And they referred to it as the presidential brotherhood, which is a collection of close associates and allies of the president. Because they were appointed by the corrupt leader and they knew that they were not accountable to the public or an independent judiciary, they engaged in extortion and bribery. So all the administrative services that were supposed to be available for free, for example, you go to request a birth certificate for a newborn, or you go to request a form for inheritance so that after a person has passed, the wealth can be transferred to the heirs. All of these were supposed to be public services for free, but they would actually be for sale. And if there was a case of dispute, the judiciary voted in favor of whoever paid the larger bribe. So here is some comment by people about what they experienced. This is by a clergy in 1984 from the article that you were supposed to read. It says, why in our courts do people only obtain their rights by paying the judge liberally? You have to pay a bribe. Why do the prisoners live forgotten in prisons? Because if you are in prison and you don't pay a bribe, your case will not be processed. You might stay in prison for many, many years without any verdict, simply staying there. Why our Office of Administration, like public services, why in our offices of administration, people are required to return day after day to obtain what is rightfully theirs, what they should be available to them quickly and freely. If they do not pay the clerk, they will not be served. So bureaucracy becomes pay for service, which is to the disadvantage of the poor, because the rich can manage to pay the bribe. Okay, so Zaire's bureaucracy under Mobutu was the opposite of Japan and South Korea. We talked about MITI, Japanese Ministry of Trade and International Trade and Industry, and how it played such a positive role in making sure transactions costs were low. So the country is governed by a predatory state. Transaction costs are very high for business. There is no guarantee of justice, contract enforcement, and respect for property. Your property can be easily confiscated, and there's nothing you can do if you do not have money or you're not connected to the leader. And of course, to maintain the system, there was significant amount of repression. You had the police, the secret police, secret service, all of them engaged in confronting anyone who expressed opposition to the political leader or who could pose a threat to the rule of the elite. Another important factor was that there was significant external support for the Mobutu regime while all of these were going on. Belgian and French troops at some points intervened to suppress the opposition to him, and the government received significant amount of foreign aid that was supposed to be used to improve the lives of the poor, but much of that was stolen by the politicians and government officials. In contrast, we can focus on some details about an example of a positive and effective bureaucratic institution. So we already talked about MITI before, but some additional insights of what they did. The MITI was created after World War II, when capital was scarce. Japan Development Bank was established in 1951 to finance industrial projects. MITI, Ministry of International Trade and Industry, was established in 1949. Its task was to allocate investment loans. In other words, when the Japan Development Bank was established, that bank would provide the financing, but MITI would decide who gets the financing for which projects. It guided the industrial process. Control over foreign exchange, again, corporations needed foreign exchange to import machinery, raw material. MITI controlled that and rewarded corporations that were successful and were producing the products that MITI wanted them to produce for global export markets. It had the power to control import licenses. It could approve tax breaks. It could coordinate competition and entry into target industries. So significant amount of intervention, which was done in a positive way to bring about success in Japan. So what were some of the characteristics of MITI? One of them was meritocracy within that organization, meaning that the high-ranking employees were primarily the graduates of top universities in Japan and even from abroad, because they immediately after World War II, they were sending students to Europe, to the United States, and gradually they returned. In this kind of focus on meritocracy, it was very similar to France and United Kingdom in terms of their bureaucratic structure. MITI created an informal network and coherence among employees, especially because so many of them were graduates of the same school. There was this camaraderie among them, which helped increase the efficiency of the organization. Perhaps you know that a university like Yale, where some of you might end up going to, has this club of Yale graduates, and they identify each other, they support each other, they find jobs for each other. Same thing with Harvard, same thing with MIT. And even Brandeis has a large club of Brandeis alumni, especially in China, believe it or not. Because so many of our graduates are now in very influential positions in China, even in Chinese government. Okay, so that strong connection helps to, again, create some kind of positive synergy within the industry. The second feature of MITI as a positive institution is the strong connection to large firms and industrial groups. And many of the people who work in MITI, after they retire, and retirement age in Japan, when it started, was very early, between 45 to 50 years of age. They would go and work for industry, and they become a connection, a bridge between MITI, that had all of those powers, and the company that they were working for. And that connection was used by corporations to sort of gain resources from MITI, and we saw how much power they have. So those are some of the factors that contributed to MITI's effectiveness. So keep in mind, these connections are not always negative and corrupt. Sometimes within the right incentives and the right environment, they could facilitate positive interactions between a government institution and a private sector institution. Okay, we have a video. Maybe it's not a bad idea to take a look at this video, if it's still active.
like that and look like the indication of the U.S. But in point of fact, Japan was involved in a very, very different economic and political pattern. The name of the game was capitalism, but Japan and the United States were playing by a very, very different set of rules.
Knows the rules of the game better than Takeshi Isayama. For decades, men like Isayama have guided the Japanese economy on behalf of MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. At this corporate baseball tournament, Isayama is the guest of honor, a sign of a special reverence for government bureaucrats not found in America. In the United States, the government is like an umpire, making sure business plays by the rules. But in Japan, the government is on the field, coaching industry. Big business and government are on the same team.
Japan to expect certain things of the Japanese government, of the central bureaucracy. Actually, there's quite a high expectation that they will be defending the national interest. And I think in the post-war period, that has been defined primarily as promoting Japan's economic development.
Like most Japanese bureaucrats, Isayama's crowded bullpen office does not reflect the prestige of his position. He heads the division of MITI that oversees the global development of Japan's latest high technology. Day after day, Isayama hears about the problems facing Japanese corporations. Then he writes the laws that govern industry. Isayama also offers special incentives to help companies develop new technologies.
MITI's job is to guide the development of Japan's future. A certain segment of industry wants to go one way, and another wants to go another way. The conflict will be destructive. It is MITI's job to mediate and choose the best road for all.
Today, the businessmen who come to see Isayama are wealthy and powerful. They must use the gentle art of persuasion to advance MITI's goals. 30 years ago, MITI was the commander-in-chief of the Japanese economy. It gave the orders, and companies obeyed.
Japan was a developing nation, and in order to catch up to the other nations economically, it was necessary for some degree of protection, financial support, and regulations. These were the primary responsibilities of MITI.
MITI funded Japan's scarce resources to key industries. In 1957, MITI decided Japan's future depended on electronics.
So remember the model of flying geese that we showed you. That country decides to move. This is an example of that. And so far what we have seen also shows that they were not really following the model of competitive capitalism. Industries, when they had competition or disagreement, it was not left to forces of market. It was MITI that resolved the dispute in favor of one or the other and created the coordination.
生活を有できて。Michi favored Japan's big pre-war companies like Toshiba, Hitachi, and Matsushita. Little companies a harder time. In the 1950s, Akio Morita helped to found a small tape recorder company that would become Sony. He wanted to buy a new American invention called the transistor, but he needed permission from Michi.
When we applied Michi, our government did not think Sony has an appropriate engineering power. So they delayed their approval. So it took more than 6 months to get the final approval to send the money.
Michi gave permission. Sony bought the transistor license for $25,000. A year later, Sony produced the first transistor radios made in Japan. Through private initiative and government guidance, the Japanese electronics industry grew at a furious pace. Music also
Okay, you're welcome to watch the rest of it later. And of course, within a few years, Japan really dominated the market for transistor radio, even more than the United States. And it was the Japanese transistor radios. I don't think you have never seen them unless in museums, or maybe your grandparents have some. But I remember them. It was innovation, because before that, radios were big boxes. It was bulb and tube radios that you had to put somewhere. But with that, people were able to actually carry the radio with them. It was an amazing revolution back then, that you can take your radio with you. But there were, like so many other inventions, as it was mentioned, often innovations and inventions took place in the United States. The inventors were here. But it was the corporations in East Asia that bought the license, and then they mass-produced at low cost. With respect to electronics, transistors, microchips, computer chips, all of this. Okay, very good. So let's go back to our model. Okay. So let's do another case study. We've done one for purely predatory state. We saw an example of highly efficient developmental state bureaucracy in Japan. Now, in some countries, what we have observed is that the total government is inefficient and corrupt, but sometimes a leader can manage to create what we call islands of efficiency, meaning that they realize that reforming the entire state government bureaucracy is a challenge. There are too many political interest groups that would prevent that, but they select one specific bureau, one organization, and try to make that efficient. And then that one outperforms the others and becomes a successful industry. So we're going to see an example of that in Brazil. So in Brazil, going back to after World War II, the bureaucracy as a whole was inefficient. The country was struggling, going back and forth between democracy and military takeover, because every time they tried to go to democracy, the country was polarized and would go towards instability. The country was politicized. Thousands of positions in bureaucracy, in this huge bureaucracy, were political appointees, meaning every time you had a new leader, a new president, up to 100,000 positions would change hand. In most bureaucracies, maybe 1,000 to 2,000 positions are appointees by a political leader. The rest of them are stable career civil servants. But that wasn't the case. Wages were relatively low, therefore incentives were limited, and bureaucracy was a job creation agency, meaning that bureaucracy was not designed for serving public good services or being efficient. They wanted to create employment. So you would have significant amount of oversupply of workers. But in Brazil, in certain periods, pockets of efficiency and professionalism were created. One of these examples was the National Development Bank, NDB. It showed significant respect for decisions of financial experts on investment loans. So the entire system and many other banks were corrupt. Credit was given based on political connection, but not NDB. Employment and promotion was merit-based, and it had good performance in approval of investment projects.